In this video, we'll be looking at section 3.4 and 3.5 together, multiplying and dividing integers. So go ahead and turn to the section 3.4 and 3.5 right now in your notes packet. So our essential question today will be, how do I multiply and divide integers? How do I multiply and divide integers? We're going to have different rules for multiplying and dividing integers when compared to our rules for adding and subtracting integers. So it's very important that as we go through this process, we keep those two things separate. Fortunately, the rules for multiplying and dividing are pretty much the same thing, whether you're multiplying or dividing. So our first rule is if we have the same signs. So same signs would be something like negative times a negative is positive. And that's always. A negative times a negative is always positive. We will add that in there. Always positive. And the same can be said for dividing if we have the same signs. So we can say negative divided by a negative is positive. And that's another always statement. Negative times a negative is positive. Negative divided by a negative is positive. And when we have different signs, we can say positive times a negative is always negative. And this statement right here is the same for division. Positive divided by a negative is negative. So a negative times a negative is positive, and a positive times a negative is negative. And we're just going to keep practicing these things until they just get really sunk in our head. So let's look at our multiplying rules. So we're going to find the product. Remember, the product is the solution to a multiplication problem. So I see 5 times negative 6. So we have a positive times a negative, and that will always be a negative. So we go negative, and then 5 times 6 is 30. Now number 2, we have a negative times a negative. So we have a negative times a negative is always positive. So we know it's going to be a positive, is going to be our result, and we do 2 times 3 is 6. Now number 3, we'll just do 2 numbers at a time. Negative 9 times 4, so that's a negative times a positive, so that'll be negative 36. Negative times a positive is negative. 9 times 4 is 36. We'll bring down that -2. Now we multiply these together. Well, we know a negative times a negative is positive, and 36 times 2 would be 72. Now let's look at these finding the powers. These are a little bit different, but hopefully we can set them up. Here, I have 2 to the third power, meaning I have 3 2's. 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. Now I want to look at 5 and 6 at the same time. Notice how in 5 the negative is on the inside the parentheses. So what this is telling me is I have 3 -2. So I have 1 -2 times a second -2 times a third -2. Now the difference between 5 and 6 is those parentheses. So when I look at number 6, I only have the 1 negative because the 3 is now only affecting the 2. It's not affecting the negative. So I'd have that negative, that 1 negative, and then how many 2's do I have? Well, now I have 3 2's. So here we'd have 3 negatives because of the parentheses telling me that there's 3 -2's. And here I have 1 negative with 3 2's. So keeping that straight is going to be a difficult task, but we will manage. So let's go ahead and do number 5 now that we have it written out. A negative times a negative is a positive. So we'll have +4. Bring down our times -2. And then a positive times a negative is a negative. So we'll have -8 as our final answer. Now let's do number 6. We'll have -2 times 2. So we have negative times a positive is. Negative times a positive is negative. 2 times 2 is 4. Bring down my times 2. And then we'll have a negative times a positive. Negative times a positive is negative, and 4 times 2 is 8. And then we're done with that problem. So we do have to go over some special cases with division. That's when we're dealing with 0. So the dividend is the top number in a fraction or the first number in a division problem. So for example, if our dividend is 0, we could say it's 0 divided by 3, or it's 0 divided by 3, or we could think of it as 0 divided by 3. And all 3 of these will equal 0. And the best way to think of this is I have a pie cut into 3 pieces. And how many pieces of that pie do I have? I have 0 pieces. No pie. Now our divisor is 0 is when we're trying to divide by 0. Now this one's a little tricky because it's when our denominator is 0, our second number is 0, or the number on the outside is 0. So we could have it look like 4 divided by 0, or 4 divided by 0, or 4 divided by 0. And this is what we'll call is equal to undefined. Now the reason why this is undefined is now we're talking about a 0-piece pie. So here we had a 3-piece pie, and here it's like the pie isn't even there. So that's why it's undefined. We have 0 pieces of a 3-piece pie, And here we're saying we have 4 pieces of a pie that's not even there. So anytime we're dividing by 0, we'll call it undefined. Okay, so let's look at some division problems involving negatives. Remember, it's going to be the same exact rules as with multiplication. I have a negative divided by a positive. So a negative divided by a positive will always be negative. And then 48 divided by 12 is 4. So same rule as if I had, let's go to number 8. Same rule as if I had a negative times a negative. But now we have a negative divided by a negative. So a negative divided by a negative is positive, and 15 divided by 5 will be 3. Now when it comes to these zeros, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, because 0 divided by anything will always equal 0. And the same can be said when we're dividing by 0. No matter what's in the numerator, 66 divided by 0 will always be undefined. So right now what I'd like you to do is pause right here. Try numbers 11 through 17. And then when you come back from practicing on those, we'll look at them together. Okay, hopefully you took that opportunity to try 11 through 17. Now let's look at them. So we're just going to use our negative divided by a negative and our negative times a positive or negative divided by a positive rules. So a negative divided by a negative is always positive. And then we do 42 divided by 7 and we'll get 6. A positive times a negative is always a negative. And we do 2 times 3 and we get 6. So we get negative 6. A 0 in our numerator will always give us the same solution. 0 divided by anything, so 0 divided by 3 will always equal 0. A negative divided by a positive will always be negative, and a 20 divided by 5 is 4. On number 15, we're going to do just 2 numbers at a time. We'll go the first two, 9 times 4. That's a positive and a positive. That's good old what we're used to, so that's 36. Then we'll bring down that times negative 2. And now we know a positive times a negative is always a negative, and 36 times 2 is 72. Now in 16, 17, if you had problems with them, hopefully you looked up at our examples for 5 and 6 above with how to deal with these. So remember when I had the parentheses around the negative, that meant I had the negative was on every single 2. When I had no parentheses, I only had the negative on the first one. 1 negative. Here we have 3 negatives. So let's try to set these up. So the negative is on the inside. So how many negative 3's will I have? Well, I'll have 4 negative 3's. Negative 3 times negative 3 will be a positive 9. Negative times negative 3 would be a negative 27. And then multiplying negative 27 times a negative 3 will be a positive 81. Now in 17, we only have the 1 negative because we don't have the parentheses. So we'll have our 1 negative, and then we'll have 2 7's. So now I have negative 7 times 7, that's negative 49. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and hope you have a great day.